You think internet will be the last nail?
That's that was actually one of the first articles I ever wrote on Islam. So before I was ever on YouTube, I was writing articles for a website called Answering Islam. And one of the earliest articles I wrote was called Islam Beheaded, the Information Superhighway and the Death of Mohammedanism. And the idea was that for 14 centuries of Islam, Muslim leaders have been able to keep their people insulated from hearing any criticism of Islam and from hearing any serious presentation of an alternative to Islam. So in other words, if you grew up in Saudi Arabia, you're going to be exposed only to Islam. You're not going to be exposed to the problems with what you're saying. You're not going to be exposed to criticisms of Muhammad and the Quran. You're not going to hear any of that. And you're not going to hear any serious presentation of any alternative to Islam. You're just going to hear Islam. And so the goal of Muslim leaders was to keep their people completely insulated. And that worked for 14 centuries. And then something started changing in the 20th century, started getting far greater numbers of Muslims coming to other countries where they would be exposed to critical information about Muhammad and the Quran. But then you had the internet, where all of a sudden critics of Islam have open access to Muslims around the world. Any Muslim with an internet connection, you can now reach that Muslim on the internet. And so their leaders are no longer in a position to keep them insulated from hearing these criticisms. And interestingly, at the same time that's happening, we also all get open access to their sources. So now anyone can open up multiple translations of the Quran. Anyone can open up Sahih al-Bukhari. Anyone can open up Sahih Muslim. Anyone can open up the history about Tabari. Anyone can have access to these books now. Whereas in the past, and so you can think about this, here in the US, there was a time in the 1960s when Islam spread very rapidly in the African American community, because Muslim preachers were coming in and saying, yeah, you see what Christianity has done with slavery. Come to Islam, where everyone is equal and all races are equal, and Muhammad abolished slavery, and all. It's complete nonsense, right? But notice, no one had their sources. No one had Sahih al-Bukhari. No one had Sahih Muslim. Most people didn't even have access to a Quran. So this allowed Muslim preachers to preach whatever they wanted, and no one was in a position to expose their lies, because people didn't have their sources. And that's what happened for several decades here in the US. When Muslim preachers would go to an area, they would just look at whatever the people in the area like, and whatever the people like, they would say that's what Islam teaches, and no one knew any better. So they would say, hey, oh, you like women's rights here? Well, did you know that Muhammad was a champion of women's rights, and he's basically the greatest feminist who ever lived? They would say that sort of thing. If they're in an area where they're talking to educated people with a respect for science, did you know the Quran is this scientific miracle, and that it's filled with all of these scientific claims that couldn't possibly have been known during the time of Muhammad? How else could this have happened unless it's from God? Whatever people liked, people wanted a religion of peace. Islam became the religion of peace. It didn't matter what people liked. Muslim preachers would say that's what Islam teaches, and no one was in a position to expose them and raise their hand and say, wait a minute, you say Islam's about women's rights, what about this and this and this and this and this and this and this? No one was able to do that. Right now, what the internet has done is now we have open access to their sources, and we have the ability to speak to Muslims in our areas where we're still allowed to speak, and even Muslims who are in places like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, any of these places where if you were there and you said these things, you'd be killed. We can communicate with Muslims through the internet. And so it's already crumbling. It's already started. And that's why you have Muslims complaining about this avalanche of apostasy. That's not my words. They're the ones who, they call it an avalanche of apostasy. They're calling it a tsunami of apostasy. The statistics from just a few years ago was that 24% of Muslim youth are leaving Islam. So a quarter of Muslim youth, and this is years ago. So this is actually going to be worse for them right now. But you're talking about a quarter of young Muslims are just leaving Islam, and so it's crumbling, and people are catching on, and it's it's just they're in trouble. It's not gonna work out for them. So they had all these methods of silencing critics and killing cartoonists and so on, and they can't deal with the internet, because the entire strategy was silence all critics of Islam, and they can't do that anymore.